Morning, everyone. Hello. Welcome to Learning About Learning with Jim. This is season 1, episode 1 of my little experiment this year. So, welcome to the folks joining us on LinkedIn and YouTube Live. Hello to people who are watching on the replay, and I guess I might put it out as a podcast. We'll see. So if you're listening on a podcast, then I have done that, and hello to you too. So this is about me doing some research into learning and then sharing it with the world, sharing what I've discovered and having some conversations with people too. I started it about a year ago as a kind of alternative personal PhD project. Had a kid somewhere in the middle there, so I had to stop. But back on it this January with learning about learning. If you're watching on YouTube or LinkedIn, you can comment, and we'll see those comments, and we can bring them in. So if you have any questions or comments or things to add, chuck it in there, and we can bring in your perspectives. I've got Nick Bennett here joining me, who asked a question on LinkedIn. So I'm going to bring Nick in. Morning, Nick.
Hey.
Nice to see you. How
Nice
you doing
to
this
see
morning?
You too. Well, good. The sun's shining. I can't complain. It's Friday, so all is right.
Cold and bright here, isn't it, in England? So let's get straight into it. I said we'd do about 20 minutes, so lots to cover. So your question was this. Could you just maybe talk around this question a bit? Where did it come from? Why is it interesting to you?
Yeah, so I think the interesting thing for me, having taken a lot of courses and delivered quite a few as well, is the theory of spaced repetition. I think in itself is quite interesting, of like how we as humans are supposed to remember things in different contexts, and how that's used in education, but also in corporate environments. But with the kind of onset of people really looking into neuroscience and how that applies to learning, the novel and engaging element always felt, or learning as a whole, learning theory is quite buzzwordy, I find sometimes. So actually, what does it mean when you say some of these things, or when people say these things? And when I've used the term novel engaging, perhaps I have a very specific definition of that. But what's a participant's definition of that? And how do you design a learning experience for a whole group of people that are different in every way, and perhaps have a different definition of what is novel and engaging for them, if you're trying to use that to help stimulate memory and recall instead of spaced repetition, or maybe in addition to spaced repetition? So yeah, it was really around like the definitions that when it's useful and how to think about it, because so much of learning, especially over the last couple of years during the pandemic, that's happened online, has probably gone in the metaphorical bin, right? People took it because they wanted to upskill, because they were concerned about their future, but how much is people actually applying and taking forward with them? So I think that was kind of the context to it.
Totally. And then in the context of kind of corporate learning as well, how much of it is just people ticking boxes, or L&D departments ticking boxes, so they say they've done stuff?
Yeah, exactly. Does it really have an outcome, or can they just write a list down to say, yes, I've ticked and moved forward, and I can get my promotion, or I can apply for my new job because I've got it on my CV?
Exactly. So we're discussing then so this idea of spaced repetition, repeating something over time to embed it in your memory, how useful is that versus creating these kind of new, what you call novel and engaging learning experiences? How can those two work kind of in concert together? So I did kind of how I'm going to run this show. Like, someone asks me a question, and I'll do some research on it during the week, and then either I come and discuss that, or we discuss that. So did a bit of research into spaced repetition, looking at the original book from Cecil Mace, The Psychology of Study, from 1963. He talks about, he quotes John Locke talking about how different people retain things in different ways, saying for some, the mind retains the characters drawn upon it like marble, others little better than sand. So, some of us, of course, remember more than others. But he says it has been shown that for most forms of learning by heart, the periods of study should be short and distributed over as long a time as possible. So I think what's interesting, I mean, that chapter is called memorization, and he's exploring memorization. So I guess if we can have a bit of a discussion around like how useful is kind of rote memorization to our work and what we do. Have you found it useful? Because for me, like we said in the chat before this, like that takes me back to cramming for exams or things outside of work, maybe, where I'm learning to lock down sourdough. I do that once every couple of days, and like I know how to make it by heart now. Do you find it useful for some things?
I think I have found it useful, but only in combination with other things, I guess. Like it feels like one tool of many, not to be used in isolation. And I think perhaps the depressing part of it, in a way, is that a lot of learning experiences I've had rely on it almost exclusively as a kind of learning tool that I'm going to make you do this a few times and then I'm going to give you a test on the end of it. And a reference point, I guess, is I won't mention the supplier, so not to bad mouth anyone. But I'm sure we've all taken them. It was a course on managerial finance, which is quite a dry topic anyway, but one I wanted to learn. And learning how to do discount cash flow analysis as part of that. Something that's really useful to have, but insanely complex if you're going from a standing start. So I think doing it as part of that worked, and even post that worked as well. But if I hadn't took the chance to then go, okay, I'm going to learn how to apply this to the business I'm in and other businesses to make sure I'm getting that context to it, I don't think it would have worked just as like an isolated, here's company X as part of the program, please do this. But the fact I was thinking about the business I worked for and the memories and experiences of that, I think seemed to bring it to light more. But equally, I definitely don't think I'd know it as well just by doing it week after week after week forever. Because one of the things I think we mentioned before, like spaced repetition dropping off over time. And I definitely don't remember it as well now as I did during the 2-week first period of the intense course. So spaced repetition seemingly doesn't quite fulfill the need that I had for that topic. But I guess maybe there is some corporate uses for it, but I'm struggling to think of them if I'm honest, really, for things.
Yeah, I suppose it's I suppose there are some things, if I think in like a work context, there are some things that we do so regularly that they become kind of second nature. So like say you're doing like a kind of agile process, you do a stand up for the first time, you don't know how that process works, but after doing that every day for a couple of months, then it becomes second nature. You've internalized it, but you're kind of directly applying it on a day-to-day basis. Whereas like just learning about that through some e-learning course, you might not. Yeah, it might not be embedded in the same way.
Well, that's a really interesting point, because then perhaps it's the semantics between application and learning. Because
yes, right.
Most learning is designed to be done as a piece of external work. So you have your job or whatever, and you want to learn or apply this new thing to your job. So you go away and you do this course, and then you try and do it in your job at the point where it comes up. But I don't know how frequently that scenario you explained was either designed by the course or content creator, or the person taking it has that application ability. So I learned how to do agile for a week or a couple of weeks, and then every day for the next 6 months, or every couple of days for the next 6 months, I'm actually doing the Scrum or whatever framework it is. And perhaps so it's not the fault of spaced repetition, it's the way it's been bastardized at different points by learning designers, maybe.
Totally. And like to your kind of point from your question about an engaging learning experience, for me, like an engaging learning experience is one that people can directly apply to their work or life, like as they're doing it or straight after it. It needs to feel relevant. Our friends Svenning and Bella talk about learning in the flow of work. So it's like it should be part of that flow of work, and you should be able to like apply it, and it should be designed in that way.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. But I still think there's a long, but then also I think the two places where there's perhaps a gap for that is, one is like actually being designed in that way, because it is difficult to design that, because a lot of challenges from a learning experience perspective tend to be big aspirational goals that people want to move from, not incremental steps forward. So putting it in the flow of work is going to be pretty disruptive. But then how does the technology sit in that as well? Because designing learning experiences that sit actually within the flow of work means it has to be within that company's sort of software stack, essentially, which how do you design agnostically for millions of different software stacks across the world. So it's a really challenging application of what would be, I guess, best practice.
Yeah, and practically it's kind of, I think it's easier to almost take people out of the day-to-day for a 3-day masterclass or something than it is to do something that they're doing for maybe an hour a day, and that you could easily get shifted because meetings come in, or I suspect that's why a lot of workshop-based learning experiences are in chunks like that, or maybe pre-pandemic were like that, because it's much easier to get people's focus time if you do it in a big block, which then that isn't good for spaced repetition.
Yeah, but I think the interesting thing when we talk about learning as spaced repetition or application as spaced repetition, like spaced repetition might not need to be a sort of design tool for the experience, but it could be a design tool for the off time or whatever, post or during the experience. And some of the best courses I've had have been so, I guess it's a weird way to describe it, but so novel and engaging that it's inspired me to want to go back and do that spaced repetition myself and go back and apply it. So flipping back is like, to me, novel and engaging doesn't just mean application being built in the flow of work. It also means that it was like a well-designed, doesn't have to be fun, I guess, because you can't say everything can be fun, like learning fire safety probably. Maybe it can be like, do our learning designers pushed enough to really go out of their comfort zone to learn new ways to design experiences that are different? I think the pandemic's been really interesting from that perspective, because we've now shifted again where lots of people caught up and have done the new sort of advanced techniques, and everyone's pretty familiar with the way to design a good digital workshop experience. But then what's the next thing, which is going to be novel for someone that they haven't learned in that way before, and it's going to be engaging. So then they're encouraged to do the spaced repetition themselves, rather than it being a prerequisite of like, I need to babysit you while you do your spaced repetition every week.
Yeah. I pick up on something you said there, like learning designers having almost the bravery to create things that are really engaging and fun. Because the kind of, as I was looking, I kind of moved on from the spaced repetition to what makes an engaging learning experience. And there's some research around the importance of positive stress in making a good learning experience. And where am I? Slide 9. So they talk about this. No, you don't need to take in this entire model, but basically they talk about, they want to decouple the word stress from something as a negative experience into this idea of a stressor. So we give, as learning designers or teachers, we put students or learners in into a challenging experience that can either be stressful, negatively stressful, distressing, or positively stressful, which is this word eustress, which is from the Greek meaning good. So positive stress, something that helps us to learn. But when I was kind of pondering on that, I was thinking, when I used to work at Hyper Island, which is a learning company that works with both students and companies. When I was working with the students, I felt much freer to create a kind of positive, stressful environment for them, because they're students on a course. Whereas with my corporate work, it's a hard sell to say, I'm going to come in and stress your staff out to an L&D department. Instead I'm going to come in, like, I'm going to help people learn, blah, blah, blah. But just to your point of like how we can be brave as learning designers when designing these things to make them engaging.
And that's really interesting, because actually, if I reflect on my own learning experiences, about 10 years ago or so, I did presentation training like quite early on in my career, and it was done by an actor. So she had no formal learning training. She didn't really understand any of the learning theory. She wasn't interested in that as such, but she did understand how she'd been taught as an actor to stand up on stage and perform and give a good performance. And it was a fairly painful experience from a stress perspective, like doing my presentation in different accents and in different characters, which I personally at that time definitely wasn't very comfortable with. So it was a stressful experience, but still now, again, I'm still able to recall. If you ask me like the things that she taught me, I could tell you instantly like the different techniques that have really stuck with me. So had it been a less stressful experience for me, where it would have been comfortable and I'd just gone through it and she told me about them rather than making me stand up and read my presentation in or read a Shakespearean monologue, I definitely wouldn't be able to recall them now. So I can really see that. But maybe then it's the fact that she didn't come from a learning background, so she didn't care what the preconceptions of this were. To her, that was normal. So this is normal. Doing a
Acting
boring
stressful.
yeah, and also doing training in this way is normal for her. If you'd said, "Oh no, you need to just come and do a PowerPoint presentation about this," she would have gone, "No, that's weird. Why would I do that?" Like in the same way, maybe a very traditional instructional designer would be like, "Well, let me make you an e-learning module because that's normal." So is it the lenses we take as people and the backgrounds we have that also defines what we think is brave in those environments?
Let's make you an e-learning model, make the user experience as smooth as possible. You don't have to you can just flow through it. You don't need to there's no stress at all. I think it's that made me reflect a lot on my kind of practice and how, I don't know, what my responsibility is to learners as they're going through these things.
And how do you adapt someone else's mindset that like would come at this from a totally different way? Like there's that great quote which I'm going to absolutely bastardize, but I think like you never solve the problem by looking at it from the same perspective, right? You need to learn how to take multiple perspectives of the problem, like almost like literally I'm going to put the 6 thinking hats kind of model or whatever. So then how do I then go, if I was a learning designer designing this as this person rather than myself, like how would I approach it to kind of push yourself a bit further? But I guess it's easier said than done to get those things signed off and the budget's approved as well.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, absolutely. We've only got a couple of minutes. I'm going to leave you and our viewers, or listeners, if we have any, with just one little tidbit from that book, Cecil Mason, The Psychology of Study. So he talks about like how can we remember things better? He's talking about how we remember things in ways other than spaced repetition, and he talks about this idea of the active and passive vocabulary. So he says that each of us possess an active and passive vocabulary, and essentially, summary of this quote is, by kind of writing essays or writing a book or giving a lecture on something, you yourself will learn so much more about it than if you just kind of repeat that thing, which I think we've all kind of experienced. If you have to, like, what's that phrase, like, teaching is the best kind of learning. So you have to really, really understand something in order to like internalize it and really learn from it. So he thinks that like doing an essay or a written examination can actually be like great learning experiences. And when it comes to kind of taking in lectures, you're listening to a TED talk or you're listening to a podcast, he reckons that he says there's 3 possible ways you can either just listen and not take notes, or fully transcribe, or listen and take notes. And he reckons that just listening and not taking notes to lectures, giving it your full undivided attention, is the best way to engage with them. So, and then whatever sticks, whatever was like sticky will stick. The things that were interesting will stick with you, which is kind of an interesting perspective. I don't know, I'm sure I've got notebooks full of notes from lectures and TED Talks and conferences that I've just never looked at. But those things, you talked a bit before about the emotional, the things that had an emotional connection are the things that maybe stick with you.
Yeah, I think it's that whole memory trick, I guess, going outside of learning, but isn't it supposedly like you have to give it context or whatever? So the thing you want to remember, you either put it in a place or an experience. So you're not remembering the thing, you're remembering more holistic part of it. And definitely my experience, rather from a research perspective, personal experience has been that's worked for me in the past, or that's what I tend to remember.
Yeah, the kind of memory palace idea. Where you situate things. Yeah, on a couple of long drives, I memorized like all the countries in Africa in geographical order, using like a journey in my head. I can't remember it now, but you know, for a couple of days afterwards, I had them all in there, in that kind of working memory. So yeah, definitely can be powerful. We're at time, Nick. Thanks so much for the chat and the question.
No problem.
It was a pleasure to talk to you. And for those folks who, yeah, if you've joined us, hope it was interesting and useful. If you've got a question as well, drop it on LinkedIn, and I can guide my research for the next week. But yeah, thanks for joining us. See you next time. Cheers.